So first up, we have Amelia Keegan, who's the Deputy Director of Government Relations at Bread for the World. Prior to coming to Bread, Amelia worked at a variety of other nonprofits, focusing on federal budget, tax, and low-income policy. Amelia received a Bachelor of Arts degree in government from Smith College and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington School of Law. A member of the Illinois Bar, she served on the board of the Washington Council of Lawyers. Then we have Raed Jawhar, who serves as AFSC's Policy Impact Coordinator at the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy in Washington, D.C. Since his immigration to the United States in 2005, he has worked on political and cultural issues pertaining to U.S. engagement in the Arab and Muslim world. Born in Baghdad to an Iraqi mother and a Palestinian father, Raed grew up in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq. He received his bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Baghdad and his master's degree in architecture with a specialty in post-war reconstruction in Iraq from the University of Jordan. Then we have Kathy Saley, who's the Associate Director for Government Affairs at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She promotes the Center's work concerning federal budget and tax issues and their impact on efforts to reduce poverty and expand opportunity with federal policymakers. Additionally, Kathy provides support to other organizations and coalitions by providing policy assistance and strategic guidance. Previously, Saley served as Director of Domestic Social Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, working on issues related to domestic poverty. In this role, she convened and led the Circle of Protection, an influential coalition of faith leaders committed to protecting anti-poverty programs in the federal budget. She has also held senior public policy positions at Lutheran Services in America and Catholic Charities. Saley received her bachelor's degree in organizational communications from Ohio University and her master's degree in social work at Arizona State University. She lives in Washington, D.C. Founded in 1943, by members of the Religious Society of Friends, or the Quakers, SCNL's nonpartisan, multi-issue advocacy connects historic Quaker testimonies on peace, equality, simplicity, and truth with peace and social justice issues. At SCNL, Tila is the lead lobbyist on federal budget priorities. As a legislative associate on domestic policy, she works on reducing military spending, ending poverty, and mass incarceration. Previously to SCNL, Tila served as the Executive Director of the Peace Economy Project, a St. Louis-based advocacy organization. And your moderator today is Melanie Feynman, an Eisendrath Legislative Assistant at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. At the RAC, Melanie focuses on economic justice issues. And we're going to start off our webinar with a devotion. We are gathered here as people of faith to pray for a just and compassionate federal budget. As Congress considers different approaches to allocating the funding to run our government, we are here to illustrate the budget negotiations and their effects on our country's most vulnerable populations. We believe that the federal budget is a moral document. We want to keep vital programs that respond to the needs of all people. In Deuteronomy, one of the 5 books of Moses, we are taught, if there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your kin. Rather, you must open your hands and lend whatever is sufficient. Let us pray that our budget will keep maintaining these ideals. As people of faith, we advocate for a just and compassionate federal budget that will promote the dignity of all Americans and will protect the vulnerable. Let us be called to act. Given the knowledge that will be bestowed to us throughout this webinar and our passions, let us speak up, judge righteously, and champion the poor and the needy. Together, let's pray for a budget that will help all Americans and ensure a bright future for this country. So now we're going to start with Amelia.
Great, thanks, Melanie. So I think as Melanie alluded, for people of faith, the federal budget and the decisions related to it in Congress and the White House are fundamental. And your voice, as a person of faith, is particularly powerful on these issues. When we talk about the federal budget, we say it's a moral document. The resources dedicated to addressing poverty tell us very clearly where they stand as a priority for our nation. Ending poverty is a commitment based in faith and prophetic witnessing with a power inspired by the promise God provides to see this through to the day when no child goes to bed hungry, no parent sacrifices a meal to see her daughter eat, and no one hears there's no room at the table. These values aren't dominated by one religion, as this coalition demonstrates. Listen, our faith traditions disagree on a number of things to say, but it is so astoundingly powerful to say that we can all get behind the following values when it comes to our federal budget. First, a shared commitment to meeting the immediate needs for vulnerable populations and people struggling with poverty. Second, a shared commitment to promoting economic opportunity and justice for all. And third is intergenerational responsibility. Knowing we don't want to leave the next generation a legacy of debt, but ensuring that we don't leave our children with a legacy of poverty is just as important. So going on to the next slide, I want to take a few moments to give you just some of the basics of budget policy so that you're equipped with the language and the knowledge that will empower you to speak up to your elected officials on some very critical decisions we expect to see in Congress over the coming months. So many of these slides, I'll say, I have to credit this wonderful Center on Budget and Policy Priorities who we get a lot of really great information from, and so fortunate to have Kathy here to walk us through some of this stuff. But I want to kind of go through just three basic types of budget laws. The first being tax laws. So tax laws, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? Changing the tax code. But something about tax legislation is once it's in the code, normally it's there for good. You think about the mortgage interest deduction or something like that. And it's unless Congress only enacts something for a temporary period, such as the 2009 improvements to the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. The second type is entitlement law. So entitlements are programs where if you qualify for the program, you automatically get the benefit. The amount the government spends on programs, on these programs depends upon how many people qualify for the program that year. So Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, SNAP, or food stamps, these are all examples. And what dictates the amount that the government spends each year is the number of people who qualify. So when the economy goes down, these programs automatically expand because more people qualify. And then when the economy recovers, spending goes on these programs goes down as fewer people are eligible for the program, as we're seeing right now with SNAP or food stamps. Now, if Congress wants to cut spending on these programs, it has to proactively go in and change the program by either changing the eligibility requirements or changing the benefit amounts. The third type of budget law are annual appropriations, and this is oftentimes referred to as discretionary spending. These are programs that Congress has to actively fund every year. So every year, Congress decides how much it is going to spend on each program. Programs like WIC, Head Start, Low-Income Housing Assistance, Scientific Research, National Parks, Education, all of these things. So if we go on to the next slide, just want to do a few more definitions for all of you. The first being, talking about the budget resolution. So on Monday, the House and Senate Budget Committees will both introduce their budget resolutions, which they're going to mark up and vote on these resolutions, but they don't actually become law. They don't go to the president for his signature or veto. Mostly they're guiding frameworks for the specific budget laws that follow. But there are two very important pieces to look out for in these budget resolutions. The first one is it sets the overall amount that the government will spend that year. It decides the overall size of the pie, and then appropriators in Congress divide up that pie among all the different programs. The smaller the pie, the harder it is to get funding for the programs we care about. The second thing is it can include reconciliation instructions, which I'll go into later, but essentially budget reconciliation is a mechanism that is there to get Congress to more easily change entitlement programs. So those programs I was just mentioning, SNAP, Medicaid, all those things. The second type of, another type of budget bill is authorizing bill. This is kind of the bill that creates the program, and then the appropriations bill is the bill that actually makes the funding decisions and funds the program. So you can create a program, but unless the appropriators in Congress give it money in an appropriations bill, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to get any funding. So going on to the next slide, this is the basic budget process. The budget resolution comes out, which we will see on Monday, one from the House and one from the Senate Budget Committees. That sets, as I said, the overall spending amount for the fiscal year. And then the Appropriations Committees then divide up that overall amount into their 12 subcommittees. And each subcommittee then divides up their allotment among the different programs under their jurisdiction. So the Agriculture Committee is going to say, hey, we're going to give this much to WIC. THUD, Transportation, Housing, Urban Affairs Committee will then say we're going to give this much to the various housing programs and whatnot. These bills then get passed, and those are the laws. So that gets passed into law and goes to the president for signature or veto. Sometimes they get combined into one big bill altogether called an omnibus bill, which we've been seeing more and more recently. The budget resolution can also include reconciliation instructions to change the entitlement programs or tax law. So what exactly is reconciliation? Going on to the next slide. So this is budget reconciliation is one of the major reasons why we see huge threats to SNAP, to Medicaid, and the refundable tax credits, those being the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit this year. So what is it? Normally when we think of reconciliation, right? Reconciliation sounds like a good thing, right? But budget reconciliation is different, and it can be a very, very bad thing, especially in this climate and in this Congress. It's a budget process that really enables Congress to much more easily pass changes to entitlement law. Programs like SNAP, like Medicaid, Medicare, as well as tax law, so the refundable tax credits are in huge jeopardy. And then it also, Congress can also raise the debt ceiling through it. A budget reconciliation bill carries special fast-track privileges. So this type of bill, it can't be filibustered in the Senate. They only need 51 votes rather than the normal 60 to get this bill through, and amendments are limited. That means if we see a reconciliation bill with huge cuts to SNAP, Medicaid, or the earned income tax credit, it's much more difficult to block this sort of bill in Congress. So going on to the next slide, what's at stake, as I just said. So budget reconciliation, it might sound boring, but the consequences are enormous, especially for those of us who are very concerned about effective programs that effectively combat hunger and poverty. So finally, I just want to say a quick note on sequestration, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues to hear more. So we already have very, very tight spending limits, which I think Kathy will talk about. Sequestration comes in and makes those spending limits even more kind of severe. And so I think that's one of those things. We did see a deal, the Ryan Murray deal, if any of you remember that, a couple of years ago, that really alleviated sequestration for 2 years, but then it comes back. And so these across-the-board cuts that were really put in place to force Congress to enact more deficit reduction in areas aside from appropriated spending has ended up just sort of taking place because Congress couldn't decide other areas to raise revenues or cut spending. So those cuts are going to be enormously damaging because we are already in such a tight fiscal climate. So that is just a few of Budget 101 terms, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Well, thank you, Amelia, and thanks for Iraq for hosting this webinar. My name again is Ra'ed Jafar. I'm with the American Friends Service Committee based in Washington, D.C. And I'll speak for the next few minutes about our military spending. It's actually not an easy issue to speak about for two reasons. The first one, it's politically it's sensitive, I think, usually. It's one of these third rail politics in D.C. to try to talk about military spending. But more importantly, we don't really have very accurate information that we all agree on when it comes to the amount of money that we spend on military. The official Pentagon budget, for example, for this year is around $495 billion. But as the slide that I'm showing now shows, the actual military spending, when you add other expenses, amounts up to $648 million. That's, you know, a significant amount more than the $495 billion. Moreover, if you add other expenses such as the Department of Energy's spending on nuclear weapons, the number goes up to $665 billion in this year. So this number amounts to almost, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but it amounts to around 55% of our discretionary spending, which, as Amelia mentioned and explained, is the budget that gets decided by the Congress every year. According to our calculations at AFSC, it actually amounts to 57% of the discretionary spending of this year. This is a huge amount of money when you think about it. You know, what's even more mind-boggling is if we wanted to take it even one step more and talk about the national defense spending. So that's what you will see on the next slide. The next slide shows, according to the National Priorities Project and information collected by them from government sources, the actual amount that we spend on defense, when you add all other non-DoD spending and veteran affairs and the share of interest on our national debt, it actually adds up to around $1 trillion this year, $989 billion in 2015. Next year it might go up even more than $1 trillion. These numbers are really huge. I mean, we're talking about amounts of money that can't really be described to an ordinary citizen. It's like a one with a bunch of zeros in front of it. Trillion, billion, million, you know, they all sound similar to each other, but they're really different. And unfortunately, we don't really have, as I mentioned, we don't have one figure that we can put as a price tag of how much money we spend on the military or national security in our nation. More importantly, the current discussions about the cuts that we had to our military in the last few years are actually not very accurate. So as the next slide shows, the actual cuts that we had for our military spending in the last year amounts to less than 0.5% of the actual proposed cuts. So, you know, there was sequestration or there was, you know, cuts across the board according to the BCA, and the Pentagon was supposed to get, or the military spending was supposed to get around $54 billion of cuts, like many other programs did. You know, keep in mind that many other programs since 2011 have received cuts that went up to 15%. We're talking about almost $87 billion in cuts to other programs. So the Pentagon was supposed to get a $54 billion cut in FY14, but then $20 billion were added back as a part of a reduction in cuts through the House Budget Committee, and another $20 billion were added through other sources. There is a special account called the Overseas Contingency Operations account that some of the base budget was added there and funneled back as we refer to it as the slush fund now in DC, and another $10 billion added by additional funds by appropriations. So we're talking about $3.4 billion in cuts rather than $54 billion in cuts. So the actual military cuts that happened last year are so tiny. But when you listen to the news, you would imagine that there were draconian cuts to the military, while other programs are out of control. So I mean, of course, it's a large issue, and I encourage many of the audiences to check out a budget proposal that our coalition, the domestic or the Interfaith Working Group on Domestic Human Needs, put out a couple of years ago. It's called the Faithful Budget. It's on faithfulbudget.org. And in that budget, we talk a little bit about military spending. We urge members of Congress to include significant cuts in military spending. But in reality, I think that's not going to happen. We're witnessing an increase in military spending in the upcoming years. So I will give the floor back to my colleagues here in the room.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kathy Saley. Again, I'm with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And thank you, Amelia, for recognizing my colleagues' great work. I'm very honored to be at the center and to work with such great people who have such a commitment to really diving deep into budget and fiscal policies, and particularly how they affect low-income communities. So now that you have some base information on the budget and the different terms that are used in the federal budget, I would like to spend the next few minutes providing some economic context and helping to dispel the myth, as has already been alluded to, that somehow our federal government spending is completely out of control and we're plunging into bankruptcy. And then I'd like to show how these investments in low-income programs are really cost-effective and have very positive outcomes. And then I would like to take some time and provide for you what we think the timeline might be on this federal budget process for fiscal year 2016 and a little bit of the political context. So you see on this slide here that if we look at the amount of debt held by the public, so when we talk about the federal debt, this is the chart that shows that. Even we at the center thought back in 2010 that things were going to be going pretty much out of control. That's when we were still, although technically coming out of the Great Recession, certainly didn't feel like it, and we thought that the debt was going to continue to skyrocket. But since then, we've really had an improved economy, and that has affected the debt. And so we have, because of the improved economy, increase in revenues coming in. We've also had interest rates being held at a very low level for a long time, so the debt that we hold really isn't costing us much money. We have policies such as the Murray-Ryan debt, the great fiscal cliff agreement that was reached in New Year's Eve a couple years ago, that also helped to contribute to deficit and debt reduction. And then also, healthcare spending has gone down. And interestingly, while we saw healthcare costs really accelerating, the federal spending on healthcare was growing at a slower rate than healthcare in the private market. But nonetheless, it was still growing. But now we have new CBO estimates out in the last couple weeks that really show that it seems as though the costs in healthcare really are slowing down, and it seems to be more of a trend and not just a blip. And so that will make a significant impact on how that will affect what we have to spend in our federal budget. Because as you saw several slides ago, healthcare spending is a significant part of the federal budget, whether that's for Medicaid, Medicare, CHIP, really good programs, but nonetheless take up a big chunk of the federal budget. So then you'll hear stories, well, you know, we really do care about these programs, but we just really can't continue to let the government spending grow out of control. In actuality, as a share of the economy, our spending outside of Social Security and Medicare and the interest on the debt is actually at historical lows. And the spending, frankly, on Social Security and Medicare is much more driven right now by demographics and the record number of baby boomers who are reaching the age of 65 right now. So that's much more of a demographic issue than a spending issue or policy issue. So this graph here shows that if you look at the yellow dotted line, that's the average amount of spending as a share of the economy. And you see we hit it peaked around 2008, 2009. Again, that was during the Great Recession. And this goes back as far as we've had data on this. So we didn't just pick, 30, 40 years. It just happened to be really good. And then the light blue line there is the projected spending. As you can see, it continues to drop and getting down near 10% of GDP, which would be really lower than the Reagan years, lower than any other time in our history that we've been keeping this kind of data. And this also demonstrates the impact of sequestration, because a lot of this spending, as we call it, this little roadmap to disinvestment, shows how sequestration has really trimmed back government spending. And non-defense discretionary, as Amelia talked about earlier, a lot of the spending is things like Head Start, WIC, Title I education, housing vouchers. It also includes things like the National Institutes for Health, Homeland Security. And so some of this is low-income spending, or spending on low-income programs, but not all of it. This next slide shows you SNAP costs. Now, SNAP is the name of the program that we used to refer to as food stamps, so it's a supplementary nutrition assistance program. And we hear how we have a record number of families on SNAP, that the costs of SNAP are growing exponential and it's really eating into the budget, when in fact it is one of those counter-cyclical programs that Amelia referenced. It's an entitlement program, so if you qualify and apply, you get the benefit. Well over half of SNAP recipients are children or the elderly or disabled. And of those who aren't, about half of them are working, of adults who are on the program. So this really is an important program that allows people to really put food on the table who otherwise would not have resources to spend on food. But those costs are going to be dropping, again, as the economy continues to improve. So this chart here, which may be a little bit difficult to see, and it demonstrates the poverty rates in developed countries before taxes and transfers, that's the blue line, and then the poverty rates for those countries after taxes and transfers. Those are the red lines. And if you're going through that list there and you're trying to find the United States, just go all the way to the bottom, because there we are. And you'll see that in our blue line is maybe a little bit above average, but it's not the highest. But after our taxes and transfers, after our fiscal policy choices, in fact, we then have one of the highest poverty rates in the country. In the world. Yes, thank you. And nonetheless, though, if you look at that blue line compared to the red line, it does demonstrate, though, that after taxes and transfers, our safety net does cut poverty nearly in half. So those are important policy choices. We can certainly do better, but the safety net really does help us address poverty in our nation. And we can do that through a variety of policies, both on the tax side as well as on the program side. And this next slide shows, for example, that those working family tax credits, the earned income tax credit, and the refundable child tax credit that we talked about earlier, help people at every stage of their life. We have a lot of research out there that shows that these tax credit programs for working families are one of the most effective pro-family, pro-work, and anti-poverty programs that we have. And in 2009, as part of the stimulus package, there were a lot of improvements added to the earned income tax credit and refundable child tax credit. And they actually lifted an additional 16 million people, half of whom are children, so 8 million children, out of poverty, who otherwise or less deep into poverty. If those improvements expire, as they're scheduled to do in 2017 without Congress reissuing those or extending those 16 million people could fall back into poverty or fall deeper into poverty. We know that the income assistance for poor children was found to have effect later in their life. They actually increased their work hours and their earnings well into their adulthood. The SNAP program, food stamps, there's a lot of research out there showing how effective that is. One study showed that adults who received food stamps when they were children actually had an 18% increase in high school completion as compared to children who were in poverty who were not receiving food stamps. Their obesity rates were 16% less than children who had not received food stamps, and the heart disease was 5% less. So not only is that good for those children and as they become adults, but it's also much better for their health outcomes, it's better for their own families, but it's also a lot cheaper. Now, we have tried to deal with the deficit reduction and to try to deal with the sequestration, as we talked about, and we've made some policy choices. And when we have looked at different proposals, such as the Ryan plan that are on the table, when Paul Ryan was chairman of the Budget Committee the last few years, he would put out his budgets, and he was getting the significant amount of his savings from low-income programs. Almost 70% of the savings that were in his budget came from low-income programs. And so you can say, well, okay, that's fine, but he's not chairman of the Budget Committee anymore. He's going to be chairman of Ways and Means. Nonetheless, as past as prologue, we still assume that the architecture of the GOP budgets in the House and Senate are going to follow some basic principles, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on the non-defense discretionary and low-income entitlement program, which if you just squint your eyes there, you'll see that that red square is really right there in the middle of those 4 arrows. But what we know is that the majority in Congress want to balance the budget in 10 years. They do not want to go to Social Security or Medicare for any significant savings, in particular for current beneficiaries. And not that we necessarily should, but they've taken those programs off the table. There are members of Congress, frankly, on both sides of the aisle who would like to increase defense, and I think we just heard a very good argument as to why that's probably not necessary. And they also want to adhere to the principle of no new revenues. So if those are the principles you're working with, and you want to continue to balance the budget and get to savings, you have nowhere else to go but to non-defense discretionary, which, as we mentioned, are those programs such as Head Start, WIC, housing vouchers, as well as things that affect all of us, infrastructure and so on, and low-income entitlement programs, which are programs such as Medicaid, food stamps, child welfare, and that's where the cuts are going to come from. Now, the non-defense discretionary, you'll see in this chart here that the sequestration is actually putting a lot of pressure on that, and those cuts are continuing to rise. The Budget Control Act called for sequestration over 10 years, and that's actually been extended some because of some other gimmicks that they did. But if you look back in 2013, there's $21 billion of cuts due to sequestration, and those were those across-the-board cuts. They lowered the cap, the amount of spending that could happen, and then they appointed, if you'll recall, the super committee, or what turned out to be the not-so-super committee, and they couldn't reach an agreement, and so the across-the-board cuts went into effect. 2014, 2015, you'll see not quite as much of a rise, but that's the Murray-Ryan deal. This year, we're going into sequestration again, and unless Congress passes legislation to increase the caps, those caps will continue to squeeze those programs. So let's look a little bit about what to expect. Amelia laid a little bit of this out, but the President has already released his proposed budget. In the next 2 weeks, the House and Senate budget committees will work on the budget resolution and then bring those to the House and Senate floor. Those are likely to include those reconciliation instructions, which will require Congress to begin to look for savings in the entitlement program. The caps are so low that we actually think the appropriations process will not be able to be completed. Normally, it's done in regular order. They get most of that done in the summer. The past few years, it's fallen apart, and it's likely to do so again. And what that will kind of lead to is the perfect storm. And we have some other things that will be happening this year. For example, the Supreme Court just heard the King versus Burwell case, and we expect that decision June 30th. So we don't expect any reconciliation bills until after June 30th, when Congress knows that they have to fix the Affordable Care Act and the subsidies for the state and federal exchanges. And they will want to deal with the discretionary funding. The debt limit will need to be raised. There will be some Social Security disability insurance that if that funding isn't addressed in 2016, those benefits are going to be cut for those on SSDI. And there's other things like the highway bill and other points of pressure that Congress will be feeling. And so it's possible that what we'll be looking at is another high-level, high-stakes negotiation going into the end of the summer and into the fall, and all of this to prevent a government shutdown needs to have some kind of agreement before September 30th. So I guess I'll just end on that positive note and turn it over to someone who I think is going to help us say, well, what can we do about all that?
So as a community, we like to talk about the federal budget as a moral document, as you heard Amelia mention at the beginning of our webinar. Because we view the way that the country invests its resources and prioritizes its spending as a direct expression of the values that we have as a nation. So I want to talk about what can we do with all the information that we've just heard. As you heard, Congress right now is deciding where and how to spend our federal tax dollars. Over the coming weeks, policymakers will be making the funding decisions that will reflect our priorities as a nation. And Congress does have the choice about where we should spend our money as a nation and how that should reflect our true needs as a nation. Now is the perfect time to get in contact with your members of Congress and tell them that we do need a budget that reflects our true needs. We need a budget that restores economic opportunity. We need a budget that ensures adequate resources for shared priorities, that prioritizes true human security and meets critical human needs at home. So how can you do that? There's many ways that you can contact your member. You can make a call. You can write a letter and send it to the office, or what I would suggest even more impactful is writing a letter to the editor. And you can also lobby your member of Congress in person. So what are we asking for? We want to call Congress while they're making these budget decisions and ask them to adequately fund anti-poverty programs in the budget. We want them to end sequestration, and if they feel like it's necessary to replace it, that it needs to be balanced and maintain a parity between defense and non-defense. We need to protect low-income entitlement programs for all the reasons that you've heard before. Sorry, our slides got a little mixed up. So I mentioned that you can contact your members in 3 different ways. So writing a letter. Lawmakers do pay attention to what's being said about them in the press. Writing a letter to the editor and mentioning the ask about the budget a budget that reflects the true needs of the nation will get the attention of your member of Congress. So to get started, you can actually go to scnl.org/resources/toolkit. And these, I'm going to say that's the general, and if you go to the scnl.org/resources/toolkit, you can figure out how to send a letter to the editor. You can also figure out how to do a lobby visit in person, and also how to make a call. Lobbying in person. So one of the most effective ways to convince your member of Congress is to schedule a meeting with them in their local office. You can drop by, and also the website that I provided shows you a guide of how to do that, how to look up your local office, and just how to figure out how to go about doing a lobby visit in person. So that's scnl.org/resources/toolkit. And then one of the easiest ways to get in contact with your member and let them know that you care about a just federal budget is to just give them a call. You can call them today after we get off the phone. You can call them in the morning. You can call them throughout all of next week while they're making these very important decisions. And you can use this toll-free number, 1-800-826-3688. Just ask for your senator or representative by name. And then when you call the office, tell them where you live, and if you'd like, share the impacts that budget cuts have had on your community or yourself and the people in it. Ask your member of Congress to support an end to sequestration, and tell the office that Congress shouldn't support any further cuts to programs that help lift and move people out of poverty.
Okay, so now that we'll open it up to see if we have any questions on the line, if anyone wants to submit questions. Okay, looks like we have one question in right now. If I've already contacted my senator or my member of Congress about protecting SNAP funding, do I need to do so again? I feel like I'm just repeating myself whenever I contact them. Does anyone want to answer that?
I would say definitely. It's important to make sure that you continue to let your member of Congress know that you're following what's going on with these low-income programs and with the federal budget process, and definitely send a message in.
I would also say it's important to meet with your representatives in person, back in the district. Maybe try to go in groups with other concerned citizens who live in that district. Building personal relationships with district staff is important. So it's not only about sending an email or calling one time. These things are important, but what's more important is having these ongoing relationships.
I would also, this is Kathy at the Center on Budget, suggest that not just going to their office to meet with them, but invite them out to places in the community. Invite them to a place where kids are having after-school snacks, or to a soup kitchen or food pantry where families are trying to figure out how to make ends meet, so that they can really see what's going on in the community and meet with people and hear their stories. I think that's as impactful as anything when they see that these numbers and charts and all that they're looking at in Washington is really about people's lives, and they can put a face to that.
New questions.
Okay, our next question is, when does sequestration end or come back up?
Sequestration does not end until, what is it now, 2024, I think, 2025. And so a ways. And but it could end if Congress decided to make different decisions. So sequestration is not, maybe this is appropriate for an interfaith call, was not written on tablets and handed to us on the top of a mountain. It is a policy choice that Congress made, and they can make another policy choice. They can change that law. And I think that right now is a good time to put some pressure on. So excuse me, I think we just went on mute. So these are policy choices, and right now is a great time because Congress is really wrestling with how to put together the budget and the spending bills, and even many members of the majority are starting to say these budget caps just don't work. We can't write spending bills and meet all the needs that we have and fund our priorities at these levels. So right now is a perfect time to call or email or visit and say, you're right, this is not a good time. We need to lift the caps.
Our next question is, can you review the timeline of congressional decision-making? When can we expect votes?
Well, the House and Senate Budget Committees will mark up the budget resolutions next week. We anticipate that those markups to happen next Wednesday and Thursday. Then the week of March 23rd, the House and Senate will just bring the budget resolutions to the floor. We expect the Senate and the House, it kind of depends on the House and Senate rules. The House is going to be more likely, it'll just kind of fly through. But in the Senate, we believe they will start the budget on Tuesday. They will have significant votes on significant amendments on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, they will have something called Vote-A-Rama, where senators can just bring amendments to the floor, and they'll do it all night or until their flights leave for their 2-week recess. And a lot of those amendments, because they're in the budget resolution, won't necessarily have the force of law, but many senators offer those amendments to kind of gauge the temperature and to see how much support they have for different ideas. And so it's really important that that your members understand what your general priorities are, and that this is really about caring for those who are in poverty. We'll hear a lot of talk about a middle-class budget and very little mention about those in poverty. And many of these programs that we're concerned about are really benefiting those with the lowest incomes in our nation.
Thank you. So now we have another question. How effective is it to ask our state representatives or our state senators about federal budget cuts?
Well, I think one way in which that could be useful is, I believe it's, and Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong, 1/3 of non-defense discretionary spending goes in the form to assistance to state and local governments. And so certainly these tight fiscal restraints carried down to the state and local level. And so if they're facing, some really tough kind of choices on the state and local level about funding decisions, if they can put pressure on the state delegation to really address sequestration and replace it with something that's much more balanced, their voice can be pretty powerful too. So I think that's just another avenue. But again, I think your voice and contacting your members of Congress is extremely, extremely important. And the more that your senators and representatives hear from you on these issues, the more, the more powerful that is. And they really need to hear this because these priorities aren't always, what's talked about in the news or made. The issues that we have don't fund really high-powered, high-paid lobbyists on Capitol Hill.
I'm going to just answer the question on the EITC, CTC, just in case that got lost. The question, where does that fall in the budget? It's part of the tax code, and so it's considered on the revenue side, so it does not show up. It's not an entitlement program. It doesn't show up as spending.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry about the confusion there. Another question. This was a lot of information. Where can I go to learn more about these issues?
Well, I'll promote our website, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Almost all of these slides come out of charts and graphs and different papers and blogs that we have done. You can sign up on our website to get information on particular issues or to get everything that we put out, and that's www.cbpp, centerbudgetpolicypriorities.org.
I think, and all of our websites, I know SCNL has a lot, and Tila had some great resources as well, ASSC, certainly the RAC, Bread for the World. We've got a special budget section if you go to bread.org/budget. And we also have a new one-pager on reconciliation. So if you want to just sort of review what that process is, why it's important, and particularly why it's important for people of faith who care about addressing poverty, that's a new resource as well.
And I believe that the webinar will be available after we end. So that is also a resource. You'll have the slides there.
Yes, the webinar is being recorded. So another question, how do we plan on taking on inequality in our work and the forces that drive inequality?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think, you know, a lot of the budget, I would say, looking at what Brad said and what Tila said about the faithful budget, I think is a really good model of a budget that we see that would kind of address growing income inequality and really reduce poverty. And so I believe you can go to faithfulbudget.org to find that budget and use that as a model of a lot of the policies of what we're looking to promote. We often talk about the budget deficit. That document looks at the budget through the lens of, well, what are our needs deficits and what do we need to be doing to get to where we should be as a society? So I think that, and kind of remembering to lift up just what our priorities are as a country and adequately funding those programs that really do help promote hope and opportunity for those struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate what Amelia just said. I think the programs that we focused on that help the most vulnerable among us, we're doing it because in order, we want funding protected for those programs so people do have the opportunity to move on to better things in their life and are able just to have that mobility. And that's getting at the root of inequality by saying, you know, we want funding for these programs so that people have the opportunities that they deserve to reach their full potential.
I also want to mention something that I don't think we mentioned during the call so far, which is the concept of parity. Many of our groups have been calling for lifting the caps on both the defense and non-defense discretionary. But many of us are against lifting the caps on military spending and keeping that on the non-military spending. Of course, keeping the caps on the non-military and lifting it from the military will only increase the inequality and issues that we're trying to fight against.
And I think in addition to looking at the fiscal policy and the spending on the safety net, which are key components to addressing income inequality, there's broader issues beyond the budget, things like raising the minimum wage, having paid sick leave, assuring that people have access to health care, those kinds of things as well. And you know, right now, if you're making $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage, you're still going to qualify for food stamps. You're likely to qualify for a housing voucher, although only 1 out of 4 families eligible for housing vouchers get access to them. So, so this is part of a much bigger piece of the puzzle.
Great answers. Another question. Often when meeting with congressional staff, the members might be ambiguous in responding to our concerns or state that the member doesn't have a position at that time. What are best practices to make sure that you get a follow-up on where a member of Congress stands on a position when you meet with them or contact them?
So I'm keeping an eye on our time, and I know that we just have a couple of minutes left. But my suggestion is the more specific our asks are, the more specific the answers can be. I think if we meet with members of Congress and staffers and talk for half an hour about, you know, equality and injustice without a specific ask, they can be more ambiguous than us coming out with very specific requests regarding legislation or policy change. So I would, check any of our organizations or other policy forums to ask for advice regarding very specific asks before meeting with legislators.
And if you get an ambiguous answer, then you can say, okay, well, when you have an opportunity to talk to your boss, I will give you a call in a week, or I will email you in 2 days to follow up to find out what that answer is.
Yeah, I would reiterate that. That provides an excellent opportunity to follow up with the office, and I mean, you want to be communicating with that office, regularly. And I think, so following up to say, hey, where's your boss, reminding them, thanking them for the conversation or the meeting. And then you also have votes. So then when the votes come up, I think one of the things we don't do well enough as a community is following up after the votes and letting members of Congress know if they voted against something, that voting in a way that we thought was the wrong way, letting them know that. And if they voted the right way, letting them know that. So that I think that accountability factor is absolutely critical.
Another question, who is funding the great work going on at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities?
Some great people. We are funded primarily through private foundations and donors, and I'm sure there's an opportunity to make a donation to the Center on Budget if you think we're doing great work on our website. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And just one last comment. Thank you so much to Carol Smith, who just sent a response from a member of Congress regarding regarding child nutrition reauthorization, a really important program coming up. So that was a very lengthy response, and showing that when you reach out to your members of Congress, they listen to you and they do care about issues that affect the constituents. So thank you. Oh, sorry about that. But thank you so much to everyone who listened in on this webinar. Thank you so much to all of our participants. We really appreciate it, and let's take these action steps to make sure that we have a budget that we can be proud of and that can stand up for those who are most vulnerable, and that we continue to speak out, judge righteously, and champion the poor and the needy. Thank you so much.